While the American 10th Army fought fiercely for control of Okinawa, the U.S. Navy embarked on a parallel operation to gain control over the adjacent islands and islets. Though largely overshadowed by the ground battle, this often overlooked island-hopping campaign was not merely opportunistic, but strategically important. Given that a bottleneck on Hagoshi beaches was straining to support the immense logistical demands of the entire field army with its 2 corps, this operation sought to open new anchorages on Okinawa's western and eastern shores, essential for ensuring a steady flow of reinforcements and supplies, as well as neutralize any remaining Japanese coastal defenses in the area, and above all, capturing the airfield on a nearby island, Ie Shima. Following the successful capture of Karama Reto and Ie Shima Islands, carried out by the men of the 77th Infantry Division in the period from March 26 to 31, 1945, to pave the way for April 1 landings on Okinawa, the Navy turned its attention to islands along the eastern shore. With the 10th Army surging across Okinawa's central plain and securing much of the Chimu Bay shoreline and the northern part of Iegusugu Bay by April 5, the Navy commanders saw an opportunity to, without delay, exploit the new eastern berths and beaches for resupply operations, vital to maintain the momentum of the 10th Army's advance. However, before they could do so, it was necessary to assess Japanese strength on the small islands blocking the entrances to these newly acquired anchorages, and this mission was entrusted to the Marine Force Reconnaissance Battalion, commanded by Major James L. Jones. Given that the preliminary aerial reconnaissance reports indicated the presence of Japanese troops on Tsugen Shima, a small island positioned southeast of the Kachin Peninsula, commanding the approach to Iegusugu Bay, this island was selected as the first target to be reconnoitered. Thus, on April 5, to determine the true strength of the island's garrison, the Marine Force Reconnaissance Battalion made a daring landing in rubber boats on Tsugen Shima's northern coast, only to be forced to withdraw after losing 2 men killed and 8 wounded by heavy Japanese machine gun and mortar fire. Since Major Jones' force's primary mission was reconnaissance rather than direct combat, the strong resistance made it clear that a much larger force would be needed to capture the island. In fact, Tsugen Shima was held by a specially organized guard force of approximately 250 men, built around the 1st Battery of the 7th Heavy Artillery Regiment, and in addition to rifles, machine guns, and mortars, the Japanese garrison was equipped with 3 152mm naval guns, 2 75mm guns, and 2 47mm guns, all of which were positioned within the main defensive stronghold along the ridge on the southwestern part of the island. The mission to seize Tsugen Shima was entrusted to the 27th Infantry Division, commanded by Major General George W. Greiner, Jr., drawn from the 10th Army Reserve. However, since the division was already in the process of disembarking on Okinawa, and the information gained by the Reconnaissance Battalion indicated the seizure of the island did not require a commitment of the entire division, Greiner assigned only the 105th Infantry Regiment under Colonel Walter S. Wynne to carry out this mission. According to the final plan, the 3rd Battalion, commanded by Major Charles de Groff, would spearhead the assault, while the remaining 2 battalions would serve as a floating reserve, ready for deployment as needed. On April 10th, supported by gunfire from 1 light cruiser, 2 destroyers and several gunboats, Major de Groff's battalion stormed ashore on Tsugen Shima's western beach. Despite light initial resistance, the battle quickly escalated into a day-long firefight with Japanese soldiers heavily entrenched in the stone and concrete rubble of Tsugen village. At first light on April 11th, Major de Groff's rifle companies launched a concerted attack to wipe out the Japanese garrison, and although machine gun and mortar fire from the heights above the village caused a steady drain of casualties, the stubborn opposition gradually died out. By 3:30 p.m., organized resistance on the island had been eliminated, and shortly afterwards the 3rd Battalion was ordered to re-embark. In a day and a half of fighting, Major de Groff's battalion wiped out almost the entire garrison, killing approximately 234 Japanese soldiers, with no prisoners taken, at the cost of 11 men killed, 80 wounded, and 3 missing in action. However, the reports captured after the battle revealed that a few Japanese soldiers somehow survived the violent combat and managed to rejoin the main body of the 32nd Army on Okinawa. Ultimately, the 3rd Battalion's action opened the approaches to Iegusugu Bay, ensuring a steady flow of supplies from the sea to both flanks of the 24th Corps in support of their drive toward Shuri. In the meantime, the Marine Force Reconnaissance Battalion was back in action. On April 7th, Marine scouts reconnoitered Yokatsu Islands, which dominated the approach to Chimu Bay. And this time, in stark contrast to the fierce resistance on Tsugen Shima, the Marines found no signs of organized defense. The absence of Japanese soldiers allowed detachments of the 1st Marine Division to occupy the islets by mid-April. Yet these actions were merely a prelude to the main event, the invasion of Ie Shima. Lying just 5.5 kilometers west of Okinawa, this mostly flat oval-shaped island, roughly 8 kilometers long and 3 kilometers wide, with its longer axis stretching east to west, housed a fairly large Japanese airfield, and once secured, this airfield would be valuable not only for providing close air support for American troops on Okinawa, but also as a staging ground for strikes against the Japanese homeland. Recognizing its strategic importance, Allied planners had identified its seizure as one of the key objectives from the earliest stages of Operation Iceberg, making it an integral part of Phase 2 of the campaign. However, after merging Phases 1 and 2 and following the 3rd Amphibious Corps' swift advance across northern Okinawa, General Simon B. Buckner, commander of the 10th Army, and Vice Admiral Richmond K. Turner, commander of the Pacific Fleet's amphibious forces, decided to accelerate the invasion of Ie Shima. On April 10th, Vice Admiral Turner assigned Rear Admiral Lawrence F. Reifsnyder, commander of the Northern Attack Task Force, to direct the operation scheduled to begin on April 16th, designated as W-Day, with the first landing set for 8 a.m. The landing force assigned to this mission was the 77th Infantry Division under Major General Andrew D. Bruce, in what was to be their second amphibious landing in less than a month. Following the seizure of the Kurama-Reto Islands, the 77th Infantry Division had spent the past 2 weeks aboard ships, monotonously circling an area some 400 kilometers southeast of Okinawa, where they believed they were relatively safe from air attack. However, on April 2nd, their expectations were shattered when a flight of 8 kamikaze aircraft plunged from the clouds, targeting the fleet. 3 of the suicide planes successfully struck their targets, including the transport ship USS Henrico, carrying the 305th Infantry Regiment, killing the ship's captain, along with 48 crew members, and wounding 120 others. The 305th Regiment also suffered heavy losses, including its long-serving commanding officer, Colonel Vincent J. Tanzola, who had led the regiment in combat on Guam and Leyte, along with the regimental executive, operations and personnel officers, and many more headquarters personnel. Most of the remaining regimental staff were wounded, while the 77th Division's total casualties from this devastating attack numbered 22 killed, 76 wounded, and 10 missing. Despite its tragic loss, by April 16th, the 305th Regiment, under a new regimental commander, Lieutenant Colonel Joseph B. Coolidge, and rebuilt headquarters by officers and staff transferred from other units from the 77th, was ready for its next combat assignment on Ie Shima. Beyond this unfortunate blow, General Bruce faced another significant handicap, as he didn't have his entire division available for the assault. The 2nd Battalion of the 305th Regiment remained behind to garrison the recently secured Kurama Islands, while the 307th Regiment was assigned as the 10th Army Reserve, tasked to feint a landing on the southern Okinawa as part of the 24th Corps' upcoming offensive. As a result, the final plan called for the simultaneous landings of both regiments on beaches identified by aerial reconnaissance as the most suitable landing sites. Thus, the 2 remaining battalions of the 305th Infantry Regiment were to land on beaches along the southern coast, designated as Red 1 and 2, while simultaneously Colonel Aubrey D. Smith's 306th Regiment would assault Green Beach at the southwestern end of the island. Once ashore, both regiments were to advance eastward, with the 305th to expand the beachhead and the 306th to overrun the airfield. From the early planning stages, the 77th Division's staff understood that artillery support could be a decisive factor in the operation's success, and since the 6th Marine Division had not yet established complete control over the Motobu Peninsula, the only solution they could come up with was to position the division's howitzers and heavy guns on Minashima, a small sand islet about 6 kilometers south of Ie Shima. the task of securing this islet a few days before the main invasion once again fell to Major Jones' Marine Force Reconnaissance Battalion. In addition to the artillery placement, invasion planners faced another challenge posed by the coral reefs fringing Ie Shima. Because reef conditions off the chosen beaches would only allow the use of landing craft for a brief period at high tide, only minimal supplies could be unloaded on the first day. As a result, assault troops had to rely on what they could carry until the 305th Regiment secured more desirable beaches farther east, designated Red 3 and 4, suitable for unloading heavy equipment. Perhaps the most challenging task in the planning process was assessing Japanese strength on Ie Shima, which rapidly spiraled into a perplexing and intractable enigma. Initial reconnaissance flights, flown in January 1945, indicated a Japanese force on the island of about 2 infantry battalions, plus some airfield support personnel. However, as the invasion of Okinawa drew closer, photographic sorties revealed a startling absence of any visible military presence on the island. Even the previously observed artillery pieces sighted in the open had vanished without a trace. In early April, even more confusing reports from air observers, suggesting the island was virtually abandoned, began arriving at the 77th Division headquarters. Yet, despite this seemingly optimistic assessment, General Bruce and Admiral Reifsnyder remained cautious, suspecting deception, and their instincts would soon prove correct. Indeed, the Japanese garrison on Ie Shima had executed an exceptional camouflage effort, successfully concealing its true strength. The largest single unit on the island was a 930-man-strong 1st Battalion of the 2nd Infantry Unit, under the command of Major Masashi Igawa. Originally stationed on the Motobu Peninsula, this battalion was nominally part of Colonel Takehiko Udo's 2nd Infantry Unit, a formation detached from the 44th Independent Mixed Brigade, and had been redeployed from Motobu to Ie Shima in November 1944. Shortly thereafter, Major Igawa's battalion became the backbone of the island's defense and was further strengthened in February 1945 after the Okinawan Conscript Labor Battalion of some 580 men arrived on the island. By April, after absorbing these conscripts, anti-aircraft, maintenance, and engineer units under his command, Major Igawa's force had grown to approximately 2,000 men. Additionally, over 1,500 local men and women joined the regular garrison, fanatically determined to defend their home island. Nowhere else during the Okinawan campaign did the native population fight as hard or as successfully as they did on Ie Shima. From early 1945, this mixed force worked tirelessly to fortify their positions, and considering that the western part of the island and the airfield area offered virtually no natural cover, Major Igawa concentrated his defenses on the only prominent terrain feature on Ie Shima that dominated the eastern part of the island, Iegusugu Yama, a steep-sided 180-meter limestone pinnacle, and the small village of Ie on its southern slope. Over time, the Japanese garrison transformed Iegusugu Yama into a heavily fortified stronghold, with a maze of concealed firing positions reinforced by tunnels and dugouts carved into the limestone, allowing clear fields of fire over the entire island. Simultaneously, the village of Ie was turned into a formidable bastion, with every house converted into a strongpoint, linked by tunnels and filled with pillboxes, concealed emplacements, rifle pits, and machine gun and mortar positions established throughout the area. Nearly every available weapon on the island, from crude spears to 75mm field guns, was concentrated in this eastern sector around the village and the Pinnacle, while the western part of the island was left lightly defended, secured only by outposts and minefields. As the construction works progressed, thousands of soldiers and civilians began to vanish from the view of American reconnaissance aircraft, carefully concealed in underground shelters and camouflaged positions, all in an elaborate attempt to deceive the Americans into believing that the island was undefended, hoping to lure the invaders into open ground and then destroy them with intense fire from hundreds of concealed positions on the Pinnacle and within the village. Despite a masterful camouflage job and expertly concealed defenses, Americans refused to take the bait. Though Ie Shima appeared to be a ghost island, with no visible sign of any defensive force, it was, nonetheless, subjected to sporadic naval and air attacks from March 25th onwards. The systematic pre-invasion bombardment commenced on April 13th, when the battleship Texas, accompanied by 2 cruisers and 4 destroyers, began firing on targets throughout the island. At the same time, naval aircraft intensified their attacks, launching 292 sorties over Ie Shima between April 13th and 15th in preparation for the coming assault. As the overture to the invasion of Ie Shima, at 4:45 a.m. on April 13th, the Marine Force Reconnaissance Battalion stepped onto the sands of Minna Island. After finding no trace of Japanese troops on the island, Marine scouts secured it in less than 2 hours, paving the way for the 77th Division's 305th, 306th, and 902nd Field Artillery Battalions to land there on April 15th and establish firing positions in support of the main assault on Ie Shima, scheduled for the following morning. Day, April 16th, dawned with a devastating bombardment. At first light, 2 battleships, 4 cruisers, and 7 destroyers unleashed a relentless barrage to soften Ie Shima's defenses. Simultaneously, gunboats swept landing beaches with rockets, mortar shells, and thousands of rounds of 40mm and 20mm ammunition, while Navy planes strafed, bombed, and rocketed the island, dropping napalm on and behind the beaches, shrouding Ie Shima in thick black smoke. Despite ongoing major kamikaze attacks against American shipping off Okinawa, the troop transport ships successfully rendezvoused off Ie Shima's shore, and shortly thereafter, the landing craft crossed the line of departure, and within minutes, the first waves of assault troops were ashore on all beaches. At 7:58 a.m., 2 minutes ahead of schedule, the 1st Battalion of the 305th Regiment stormed ashore on the southern coast, just below the airfield, followed closely by the 3rd Battalion, which began its landing just 3 minutes later on a separate beach about 500 meters to the west. Facing little initial opposition, the troops of the 305th Regiment rapidly secured the beachhead and began pushing inland. Shortly after, at 8:07 a.m., the first waves of the 306th Regiment came ashore at the southwestern end of the island, with the 1st Battalion on the left and the 2nd on the right, while the 3rd Battalion followed 2 hours later and remained in reserve. At first, resistance was light, and despite advancing over open ground with limited cover, battalions of the 306th Regiment quickly overran the airfield. The sole obstacle to their advance was a heavily mined area, where hundreds of hastily laid and camouflaged aerial bombs severely restricted vehicle movement, hampering efforts to support the infantry. By nightfall, after pushing more than 5 kilometers and gaining nearly 2/3 of the island in a single day, the 306th Regiment, with all 3 battalions abreast, halted about 500 meters from the base of Iegusugu Pinnacle, forming the line extending to the northern coast. In the meantime, after advancing inland and wheeling to the east, the 305th Regiment had run into stiffened opposition as soon as the regiment turned to drive east in a zone parallel to the coast. After moving barely 700 meters, the 1st Battalion's advance ground to a halt under intense rifle and machine gun fire from emplacements west of the village. The 3rd Battalion, which made the wider turn on the left of the regiment, had made better progress only to be halted at the village outskirts. Throughout the night, Japanese forces launched a series of desperate, suicidal counterattacks and infiltration attempts against the 305th Regiment, all of which were repelled with ease, and in the morning, American troops counted 199 dead Japanese scattered in front of their positions. Following a brief artillery bombardment from Ie Shima, the attack resumed on April 17th. In the 305th Regiment sector, the 1st and 3rd Battalions pushed eastward, and while the 1st Battalion, moving along the coast, encountered only scattered resistance and progressed approximately 800 meters, the 3rd Battalion, on its left flank, met mounting opposition as it approached the heavily fortified village. Hard fighting in the outskirts of Ie reduced their advance to barely 200 meters. Meanwhile, in the northern sector, the 306th Regiment remained in the previous day's positions to allow the 305th to come abreast before moving forward, limiting its activities through the day to intensive patrolling into the eastern part of the island and probing the Japanese defenses around the imposing Iegusugu Pinnacle. At the same time, driven by a desire to capture the island swiftly and realizing that the 305th Regiment's advance was losing momentum without securing beaches Red 3 and 4, General Bruce decided to commit Colonel Stephen S. Hamilton's 307th Regiment to assist them in their efforts. However, as the 307th was assigned to the 10th Army Reserve, tasked with conducting a demonstration landing off the southern beaches of Okinawa on April 19th, General Bruce requested its 2 infantry battalions from General Buckner, promising to return them by noon on the 18th or earlier. After receiving General Buckner's assent, the 2nd and 3rd battalions of the 307th landed on Red 3 and 4 beaches just southwest of Ie Village on 12/10, and unlike the previous day's landings, the 307th's troops came ashore under a barrage of heavy Japanese machine gun and mortar fire. After regrouping at the beach, at 1 p.m., both battalions of the 307th Regiment pressed inland against steadily increasing resistance. Passing through the lines of the 1st Battalion of the 305th Regiment, which had been reverted to Division Reserve, the troops of 307th pushed uphill through numerous minefields and across open ground, fully exposed to fire from Japanese positions on the high ground, and upon reaching the village, they quickly became engaged in fierce house-to-house fighting, until their advance was halted after stumbling upon a well-fortified position protected by barbed wire and minefield, situated on a prominent ridge and centered on a large reinforced concrete building on a steep rise. This building soon became known as Government House, while the hill on which it stood earned the grimly fitting name Bloody Ridge. As the day wore on, it became clear that the Americans had walked right into a hornet's nest. The mined and debris-filled streets prevented tanks and self-propelled guns from entering the village, leaving infantry and engineers to bear the brunt of the brutal close-quarters combat as they moved forward. Despite advancing roughly 600 meters during the day, by evening, intense fire from Bloody Ridge forced the 307th Regiment to pull back to more favorable defensible ground about 300 meters inland from the beach. And with darkness descending and casualties mounting, hopes for a swift victory began to fade. Yet, despite surprisingly strong resistance and limited progress, following the 307th Regiment's landings, the 77th Division finally gained control over beaches Red 3 and 4, and after 2 days of the operation, during which the supply level arriving on shore was only barely adequate, securing this section of the coast enabled the unloading of heavy equipment on the evening of April 17th, and by the following morning, the beaches became congested with supplies, despite remaining a dangerous place close to the front line, subjected not only to heavy mortar fire, but also to Japanese infiltration attempts, which had to be repulsed by shore party engineers. With reinforcements and essential equipment finally reaching the shore, the focus shifted to coordinating the next phase of the battle. Although General Bruce frequently visited the island, the 77th Division headquarters remained aboard the ship, while the direction of the ground operations was assigned to Assistant Division Commander Brigadier General Edwin H. Randall. Having landed on W Day, Brigadier Randall established a small forward headquarters alongside the 305th Regiment's command post, and now, concerned about potential delays in securing Ie Shima, he urgently requested the retention of the 307th Regiment on the island. After General Bruce secured approval from the 10th Army, the attack resumed on April 18th. On the 77th Division's left flank, after spending most of the previous day intensively patrolling and digging in, at 7:30 a.m., the 306th Regiment moved out to clear the northern sector and close the ring around Iegusugu Yama. Despite constant mortar fire and sporadic resistance from Japanese holdouts in cave positions along the northeastern coast, the 306th made substantial progress. In the meantime, the 305th and 307th Regiments faced far greater resistance. As the battalions of the 307th Regiment, tasked with making the division's main effort, pushed deeper into the stone rubble of Ie Village, they got engaged in increasingly vicious hand-to-hand fighting for every street and house, using only rifles, hand grenades and bayonets, while artillery proved ineffective in this carnage, as the risk of hitting friendly units was too great. The 2nd Battalion of the 307th bore the brunt of the fighting as it attacked directly into the strongest Japanese defenses on Bloody Ridge. They were supposed to be supported by the 3rd Battalion of the 305th Regiment, but they also became bogged down in the narrow streets of Ie until they were eventually ordered to shift north of the 307th to close a gap and maintain contact with the 306th. To the south, after grinding to a halt directly below Government House, the 3rd Battalion of the 307th Regiment was ordered in the afternoon to advance east and try to outflank Bloody Ridge from that direction in an attempt to break the deadlock. However, the maneuver was only partially successful, as the Japanese defenses in that area proved just as strong, forcing the battalion into a prolonged and grueling fight. To protect the 307th's exposed right flank, the 1st Battalion of the 305th was committed from reserve to move abreast of the 3rd Battalion. Advancing along the southern coast, the 1st Battalion of the 305th met virtually no opposition, and by the end of the day, its forward elements had advanced about 1 kilometer. Thus, as night fell on April 18th, all American battalions on the island had been engaged in combat, without any reserve available, on what became the bloodiest day of the battle, resulting in the bulk of the 77th Division's casualties. Among those casualties was the renowned war correspondent and Pulitzer Prize winner, Ernie Pyle. After covering events from the North African and Italian campaigns and the Battle of Normandy, during which he became one of the best-known American war correspondents, in January 1945, he was transferred to the Pacific Theater. On April 18th, Pyle was traveling by jeep with Colonel Coolidge and 3 other officers towards the 305th Regiment's new command post, when the vehicle came under machine gun fire from an isolated Japanese detachment concealed behind the line. The men immediately took cover in a nearby ditch, but when Pyle raised his head a few moments later, a second burst struck him just below the rim of his helmet, killing him instantly. Pyle was buried on Ie Shima in the 77th Division Cemetery, and the division erected a marker in his honor, which was later replaced by a monument inscribed simply, "At this spot the 77th Infantry Division lost a buddy, Ernie Pyle, April 18th, 1945. The following day, April 19th, as on the previous 2 days, the weight of the American assault remained focused on the southern part of the island. Once again, the 307th Regiment, backed by the 305th, spent the day locked in a brutal struggle to seize Ie Village and break the Japanese defenses at Government House and Bloody Ridge. Progress was agonizingly slow and measured in mere meters as the battle devolved into a relentless series of bloody skirmishes fought at point-blank range. With only small arms and bayonets, American soldiers clashed in desperate hand-to-hand combat against determined Japanese defenders, and even, disturbingly, against armed civilians. In the maze of ruins, shattered buildings, and the chaos of rubble, where fields of fire rarely extended beyond 10 meters, American soldiers fought their way from one strongpoint to another, often firing on anything that moved. Throughout the day, the 3rd Battalion of the 307th Regiment took over responsibility for operations in the eastern sector of the island, relieving the 1st Battalion of the 305th Regiment, which was ordered to leave its position and move west to reinforce the rest of the 305th and 307th Regiments in the village. Meanwhile, as all frontal attacks on Government House by the 2nd Battalion of the 307th failed, the battalion executed a flanking maneuver, pushing west under heavy Japanese fire through rubble-covered narrow streets before turning east to strike the stronghold from this direction. After hours of vicious combat, at 1:30 p.m., both the 2nd Battalion of the 307th and elements of the 305th almost simultaneously reached the crest of Bloody Ridge, but their success was short-lived. Almost immediately, the Japanese launched a determined counterattack, driving off the 1st Battalion of the 305th from the ridge back to its original position, leaving the 2nd Battalion of the 307th isolated about 250 meters to the west. The 2nd Battalion held its ground as long as possible, but with their ammunition running low, they were forced to pull back. During this withdrawal, Private First Class Martin O. May volunteered to stay behind and provide covering fire for his retreating comrades. He remained at his post for the following 2 days, manning his machine gun, despite relentless Japanese fire, continuously refusing to withdraw, even after being seriously wounded, and he held his position until he was killed. For his exceptional valor, Private First Class Martin O. May was posthumously awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. In the meantime, in the 306th Regiment's zone of action, no advances were made throughout the day. Once again, the 306th remained firmly entrenched, under orders to hold its positions from the previous day, as any movement in the confined area risked exposing its troops to the artillery bombardment pounding Iegusugu Yama in support of the main assault from the south. However, this period of limited action was about to end, as the burden of the assault would shift, and soon the 306th Regiment would find itself at the very center of the battle. As the battle for Ie Shima had dragged on far longer than anticipated, and what was expected to be a swift operation aimed to secure an airfield for support of ongoing operations on Okinawa had turned into 4 days of relentless combat with no ending in sight, placed General Bruce under immense pressure. Thus, determined to overcome the stalemate, he decided to shift the main offensive effort for the April 20th attack from the 307th Regiment, south of Iegusugu, to the 306th, north of it, while the rest of the division was to tighten the ring around the Pinnacle. At 9:15 a.m., following an intense artillery preparation, the 306th Regiment, spearheaded by the 1st Battalion and supported by tanks, rushed forward, breaking through the minefield before reaching Iegusugu Yama's lower slopes. While the 2nd and 3rd Battalions remained in position, protecting the 1st Battalion's flanks, the 1st Battalion executed a textbook uphill advance, aided by a wide range of supporting weapons from tanks and mortars to anti-tank guns which ringed the mountain. Despite casualties, the infantry crept and crawled, but steadily moved forward, clearing cave after cave and pillbox after pillbox. By noon, they had fought their way to within 200 meters of the peak, where they paused to reorganize. After another artillery barrage at 2:40 p.m., they resumed the attack, again in a spirited drive up the progressively steeper mountainside, and by nightfall, the 1st Battalion of 306th was spread across the northern slopes of Iegusugu. While the 306th Regiment was assaulting Iegusugu from the north, the rest of the division maintained steady pressure on Bloody Ridge. After several hours of brutal close-quarters combat and grueling meter-by-meter advance, the 2nd Battalion of the 307th once again seized the government house, while simultaneously the 1st Battalion of the 305th reoccupied the summit of Bloody Ridge. This time, however, both battalions wasted no time fortifying their gains, establishing perimeter defenses in preparation for the inevitable counterattack. Throughout the night, small groups of Japanese probed the American lines around Government House and Bloody Ridge, seeking weak spots, and at 5:30 a.m. on April 21st, following an hour-long mortar shelling, about 400 Japanese soldiers, joined by armed civilians, stormed the 2nd Battalion's lines on the left flank. In a fierce charge, the Japanese breached the line and penetrated the battalion command post just below the government house. There, staff officers, clerks, cooks, drivers, and attached engineers rallied together to form a desperate defensive line along the hill's crest. Fighting for their lives, they held firm, and after an hour of brutal close-quarters struggle, the Americans drove the Japanese back and regained the lost ground, this time for good. By then, however, the 2nd Battalion of the 307th Regiment was severely depleted. Not only had its companies been reduced to roughly a platoon strength, but nearly all of its original 30 officers had been killed or wounded. That morning, the battered 2nd Battalion was pulled out from the line and relieved by the 3rd Battalion of the 307th. With the 77th Division's battalions now operating so close to one another that careful coordination was necessary to prevent troops from firing on friendly units, General Bruce ordered carefully orchestrated successive attacks so that one battalion could attack while others took cover. The first to move was the 1st Battalion of the 306th, which early in the morning scaled a steep cliff under sniper fire, and at 10:25 a.m. the American flag was raised at the very tip of Iegusugu. Shortly after, the remaining 2 battalions of the 306th pressed forward, eliminating Japanese strongpoints at the eastern and western bases of the Pinnacle. Around noon, the 3rd Battalion of the 307th began mopping up the last pockets of resistance in the village sector, stretching from the government house to the southern slopes of Iegusugu. At the same time, both battalions of the 305th Regiment made equally successful progress, reaching the base of the Pinnacle in their zone of operation. And at 1:45 p.m., Brigadier Randall notified General Bruce with the long-awaited message, "All organized resistance crushed." Disorganized resistance, however, continued in the following days, as many Japanese troops remained concealed in emplacements, underground passages, and strongholds within the Pinnacle. For 5 days after Ie Shima was declared secure, the men of the 77th Division carried out mopping-up operations, sealing cave entrances and clearing pillboxes, while the engineers were removing the thousands of mines scattered across the island, mostly on or around the airfield. On the night of April 22nd, the last noteworthy encounter on Ie Shima occurred when a group of Japanese soldiers and civilians rushed from caves on Iegusugu toward the lines of the 306th Regiment in one last desperate banzai charge, only to be eliminated without loss to American troops. In the aftermath of the six-day battle, the Americans recovered 4,706 dead Japanese, mostly civilians, while 149 Japanese soldiers were taken prisoners. The remaining civilian population was relocated from the island to prevent interference with airfield construction and was allowed to return after the war. Victory, however, came at a heavy price. During the battle, the 77th Division suffered 239 killed, 879 wounded, and 46 missing in action. Moreover, due to the intense close combat fought by small arms, most of the wounds sustained on Ie Shima were unusually severe, and a significant number of the wounded never returned to service. Yet their sacrifice was not in vain. Shortly after the battle, the engineers began repairing the airfield, and by May 10th, one fighter group was already operating from the island. By mid-May, all taxiways and runways were fully operational. As expected, once operational, the airfield on Ie Shima proved to be an ideal base for the support of operations on Okinawa and for preparing later attacks on the Japanese homeland.